Slides. So welcome everybody, and I'm doing this quick mental adjustment because I apologize. It didn't occur to me that we'd have some folks from other countries, and but I'm thrilled. I am embarrassed to say I forgot about BU's reach, but I am just delighted that you're here. But it will take a little bit of adjustment in what I'm talking about because there's one point where I'll be talking about legal requirements, and of course there are United States legal requirements, but I will adjust them as we get to that point. A little bit of context about this presentation, and some of these are maybe in the category of disclaimers. I don't know who you are. Some names I recognize, but for the most part not. I can't see your faces to let me know if I'm on course or if you have questions. I've done a lot of uh, presentations, teaching, etc., and I rely on feedback from my students letting me know, through their big question marks on their face or their facial expressions about whether I'm making sense or not. And without that, it's a little difficult. So. But I'm an optimistic person, so I'm hoping I'm getting at what you're interested in. But if you have questions, please do enter them and I'll attempt to clarify. Um, I have made some assumptions that you're either a parent of a child with a disability or a teacher who wants to know about this particular topic. And if you're a teacher, why aren't you with your students and how is it that you're on your webinar? But I'm glad you're here and I'm assuming that your students are well taken care of. But I'm going to assume that you're associated with BU as an alum or current student perhaps, or faculty. So let's just say go Terriers. And I want you to look at Rhett a little bit and think about the topic of this presentation. And look at that face and ask what part of this suggests willingness to work together and collaborate. And so obviously, around this topic of collaboration, a big part of the process is that leaning in, listening, being open. And this is an image that I actually have seen in team meetings that has indicated not the willingness to be involved and to collaborate. So I pulled down the image thinking I wanted to make the terror connection. Then I realized what a good image it was to get at some of the points that I wanted to make. Where I'm coming from in this presentation is this. I'm a parent, but my students don't have special needs. I'm a long-term professional working with a variety of children with disabilities and working as that classroom teacher, as an administrator, as the consultant working with a school district on both sides of cases with school districts, with parents. So what I am going to be presenting is information that I've gleaned from both my personal experience and the research literature and the general descriptions of best practices related to collaboration. Some of these, so if you tuned in thinking that I was going to be able to, that you would get from this seminar, absolute, here are the answers. That's not this webinar, unfortunately, because it's much more of a dance than that. It's much more of of an art to making collaboration work. No clear answers, but suggestions. And what I'm going to be describing is what I have gleaned in terms of best practice guidelines on how to do this dance of collaboration among parents and teachers. And some things to think about. I suspect some of this is not brand new. They are things that you've thought about before. But hopefully it will bring some things in focus and help you understand some of the challenges and good practices around collaboration. The vision that I have, that I keep in my mind, but didn't say as well as this group did, is parents and professionals are collaborating when they work together in an equally reciprocal relationship that's based on mutual trust and caring. That's the image that I hold on to. That's what I try to achieve when I was working directly with parents as a classroom teacher, but then also when I work with districts to achieve this. I'll mention this again later on, but that I love that picture of me that was put up on the slide earlier. It's an old picture and they keep wanting to take a new one. And I say, I'm fine with that old picture because it's probably about 20 years old. So that will give you an idea. I am, I don't want to say old, but mature. And the reality is that when I started working as a classroom teacher, it was before there was a comprehensive United States special education law that said we had to work with parents, that we should work with parents. But it always seemed to me like we should work with parents because it made sense. And in fact, in terms of my own experience, when I first started teaching, I felt the burden of having to make a lot of decisions by myself as a classroom teacher. And when the special education law went into effect, and I'll point out some relevant parts of it, it said that teachers should work in collaboration with parents. I personally felt a tremendous relief that it wasn't all my responsibility, that in fact it was sanctioned by the US special education law that we should work collaboratively. So I've always operated from that basis, that it's shared decision making. We need to work together to figure out what's right for individual students. And it's often not easy, but always worth the effort. And when we're doing it right, there is this equal reciprocal relationship. There is mutual trust, caring, etc. So that's what we're aiming for. The best route for advocacy is becoming a collaborator, working with, not against. So the word special education advocacy often takes an adversarial turn toward, fighting for rights for kids. It's been my experience that it always works better when the fight is a last resort, not the first step, and collaboration is, usually more successful. This image was one that I found within workplace collaboration that I thought represented the message that I want to convey, which is one of everybody has a little piece of this puzzle on how to best serve children. And at the table are a lot of different professionals and parents putting that piece together, and collaboration is the only way to do that. But there are some barriers to successful collaboration between special education professionals and parents, and we are acutely aware of it. We can't always help ourselves, but special education is sometimes considered to be a foreign language. We talk about our alphabet soup. And this graphic throws some of them out there: AAC, RTI, FBA, IEP, SLP, PBIS, ESY, OT, LRE. They're all terms that have very specific meaning to those of us in the field, although my students told me not yet to them. They haven't learned all these initials, but they soon will. And we can easily enter into discussions that, not intentionally, but are exclusive of parents because we're talking our special education language. So for example, Sam is on an IEP instead of a 504 for his SLD. The SLP recommended to receive his recommendation. Well, that doesn't make any sense, to his FAPE, and for him, the LRE is a point for a classroom, and they also recommend that he receive ESY. So you got that? Have any idea what that says? Doesn't really matter, but basically it's saying he's on an individualized educational program, and instead of a 504 accommodation plan for a specific learning disability, the speech and language pathologist recommended that for him to receive his free appropriate public education, and for him, the least restrictive environment is a sub-separate self-contained classroom. The .4, by the way, is a Massachusetts term only. And when I moved from Wisconsin to Massachusetts, I got to experience what everyone was talking about as special education as a foreign language. Different states even have their own terms. And they also recommended that he receive extended school year programming, summer programming. So just an example, and those of you who are parents might have already experienced this. Those of you who are professionals, remember that this excludes parents. We don't necessarily do it deliberately, but it ends up being the consequence that we are not supporting collaboration because we're excluding people from conversations. Another barrier is the lack of clear answers. This is hard to say as a long-term special educator. I've been studying students with disabilities for a very, very long time. And when I graduated from college, I was pretty certain I knew all the answers. And the longer in the field, the more I know I don't know any answers. There aren't really clear answers. We've been doing a lot of research. We are working really hard to identify the answers around students, but some of you, I'm sure, have heard this term about children with disabilities. These kids don't come with manuals. They are not typically developing, or they have learning differences, or they have different kinds of disabilities that interfere. And while there are a lot more guides on typically developing children, children with disabilities don't develop typically, and there are so many individual differences that we don't often know the answers. We don't have the manuals. There are not clear answers about how to best educate them. There are a lot of individual differences, which I just pointed out, that you are acutely aware of, I'm sure. There's little conclusive research. There's little evidence-based practice. I'm sure you've heard the term that's being used across disciplines, evidence-based practice. Education, special education uses that term as well. And we talk about it in terms of the goal is to have evidence-based practice, meaning there are methods, interventions, etc., that have excellent research methodology or generalizable to very clear populations. We really know that if we use this intervention, the likelihood of it being successful is high if we use it to a similar population. We don't have many of them for any of our populations of students with disabilities. And the more severe the disability, the less clarity we have around evidence-based practices. So we have categories like potentially evidence-based, having mixed effects, works with some kids, not with other kids, having negative effects, it really didn't work at all. In fact, it was detrimental. Having insufficient evidence to categorize their effectiveness, we don't really know. So our field is working really, really hard to find those practices that everybody can agree upon, but we don't have it. And some of the reasons why we don't have it is that there are so many individual differences among the population, and they are in such small numbers. That is, the number of students with disabilities is relatively small compared to general population. So it's really a whole lot easier to define a math curriculum for second graders, for example, because there are so many general education second grade students, that we could get the large numbers of students, of subjects, to be able to come up with more conclusive research. But when we're talking about students with disabilities, the numbers are much smaller, and the variability among them, which should have been the next point, that's down, the variability is so great that we have a hard time coming up with really, really clear research that gives us all the answers. So why am I talking about that in terms of collaboration? Absent clear evidence, absent that clear data that lets us know this is going to work with all kids, we have a research base to look at, other research articles that give us some suggestions of ideas, but we don't necessarily have the evidence that say, if you do this, this absolutely will work. So the result is that we have a lot of opinions about what's going to work. It's very hard, and because there's opinion, it's very hard to come up with agreement, or it's very hard to create arguments about, if only you do this, then it will be successful. We're not able to say that in a lot of cases. So we have opinions that are based on our experience, sometimes based on our values, absent data. People hold on to certain values about what should be happening for students in general, students with disabilities in specific. And so arguments about what to teach, how to teach, where to teach might be less based on data and more based on personal values that individuals have. Based on whatever research there is, but the consequence of all this is we're in this situation of having lots of differences of opinion about what should be happening, and not a lot of definitive answers to guide us. So I put this in there as being one of the clear areas. It's my phone. I'm going to pick it up and hang it up so that it doesn't ring. Sorry. Lots of differences of opinion that can sometimes serve to disrupt that whole collaborative process, or at least create challenges to the disruptive process. Sorry, that phone call is persistent. And maybe there are lots of opinions. So I have been in some interesting meetings where just about everyone around the table has different opinions. And just to name some people around the table, it might be the family members, the student, his or herself, the special education teacher, special education administrator, occupational therapist, physical therapist, speech therapist, psychologist, social worker, parent advocate. So a lot of different people and a lot of different opinions. And we have to come to consensus around those various opinions. Another barrier that has to be mentioned is time. There is rarely sufficient time for folks to meet and talk about the differences of opinion to come to consensus. Lack of time on the part of the school professionals because they're working with more than just one student, and lack of time on the part of families who have other children, have jobs, etc. And so that becomes a real significant barrier to getting folks together to come up with decisions that are of benefit to children. So I started with negative. I want to turn to, well, what can we do about it? What are some things that might be helpful? What are the things that facilitate collaboration? And again, I'll just say that you probably are aware of a lot of these, but I think sometimes it's helpful to think about them in one setting and think about strategies that might be helpful to you individually to come to consensus around programs for students. So some facilitators are just plain reason, and by that I mean, of course we should work with parents. So there are professionals who just come at it with that notion that that makes sense. Some of us teachers, I know I'm a university professor now by job and pay, but I think of myself as a classroom teacher. I just always thought, of course I should work with them. I really only have them as a teacher 5 hours out of the day, 6 hours out of the day, and maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years of their lives. But really, the child, the student belongs to the family, so of course we should work with them. And most professionals believe this. So that reason is a really important facilitator of collaboration. And I just think it's important to remember that periodically. And vice versa. Of course, we should work with parents, is the belief of some parents. I have to say, some parents think that's the teacher's job. Some parents think teachers are should know out of great respect for teachers, the teachers are the ones who have the knowledge and they should make the decisions, and I will go with what they opinion. So I've just turned this into a barrier to collaboration, but there's two sides of it. In many cases, the parents, in terms of the facilitator, say, of course we should work with teachers. They do have the specialized knowledge of instruction around students with disabilities. I may know my kid better, but they know that whatever literature there is, and of course we should work together. So that just plain sound reasoning of we together we can do more is a real important facilitator. Each has a piece of that puzzle that we need to put together. Some of the kids that I worked with, my 5 hours a day just did not tell me what happened. Or all of them that I worked with did not tell me what happened at night or didn't tell me what happened on the weekend. And so it was hard for me to develop instructional programs for the students if I didn't know what was happening the rest of the day. And my goal was not to teach kids to learn how to live at school. My goal was to teach them how to live with their families and at home. And in the community. So everybody has a piece of that puzzle. Of course, we have to work together. In the United States and in other countries, there are federal or state laws that also facilitate collaboration. I never like this as the first argument. That's when I teach my classes, that I don't say you have to do it because it's the law. I say you have to do it because it just absolutely makes sense for the reasons that I just talked about. But nevertheless, it is the right thing to do, and I already talked about the experience that first it was all my responsibility and I felt overwhelmed by it, but then shared responsibility, and I really did have that reaction of hooray, it's not all me, I've got others helping me. But we do have the law that does say that collaborating with parents, working with parents, parent participation is a requirement. So another facilitator, kind of. The law works in two or maybe three ways, depending on how you view my next list. It's absolutely a facilitator in that it says that we're required to get input from parents. We're required to get permission from parents to do evaluations. We're required to get parent input on the development of the IEP. Again, never my first argument. We should do it because it's the right thing to do and it makes sense in terms of putting together all of the information. But the law facilitates because it says we do, we as teachers, school districts must involve parents. But the law also works as a consequence. And so one may view it as a negative reinforcer. I have to work with the parents or they might sue me, which again is not the way I like to look at it, but it's important to know. And Again, I don't exactly know who you are in the audience, but I'm thinking I'm seeing some teachers' names and maybe some parents. Um, know that you do have this as an option to facilitate your participation in the child's program, but there are probably some better ways of getting at it and using this as a last resort. It's also a punishment. Negative reinforcement, folks might involve parents because they want to avoid a lawsuit, but there are provisions within the special education law, parent participation and due process, that if a district is not um, uh, implementing programs or placements as you as parents wish, the law can be used as a consequence. That is, that there is a mechanism for airing disagreements that can result in the district then having to implement practices as you recommend if it's found that your recommendations are best. So spelling this out a little bit, and there's a lot more about this, and I'm really just touching the surface of this, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that there are these legal protections. These protections were built into our U.S. federal law based on the history of school district unilateral decision making. That is, schools would make decisions about special education programs for students without ever asking the parents anything in some cases, and without ever asking permission to evaluate a child to determine whether they did or did not have a disability. And children were unilaterally placed in special education programs without parent participation. Because of some key court cases that occurred prior to the development of this comprehensive U.S. special education law, built right into it were provisions for parents' participation. And they are articulated this way: the parent right to notification that there's going to be an evaluation, notification that there's going to be a meeting, notification about discussions about their child, a process for if the discussion doesn't lead to a decision that parents are not pleased with, there's an opportunity to have somebody come in and mediate the conflict, conflict resolution as a process, mediation for that conflict, an impartial hearing officer from the state coming in and listening to both sides and making a decision. Mediation being, of course, the process of getting people to come to agreement. But if if that's not successful, there's an opportunity for an outside hearing officer to come in to make the decision that, based on that individual's collection of expert information, decides is the right decision. But if either party disagrees with that decision, there's a process for appeal with first the state education agency and then outside into the court system. And I'm sure to some of you this is not new information, but for those of you who it's not, for those of you for whom this is new, know that there have been, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 cases that have gone through the court system, then to the U.S. Supreme Court for decision, that has served to help interpret the original law in terms of decision making for students with disabilities. So again, it goes out of within the district and within the state educational system to the opportunity for parents to continue to disagree with the school district and have a decision made all the way up to the Supreme Court. So this, frankly, is the part that I don't like, but I felt obligated to talk about it. I don't like it because I would so much rather focus on ways of getting at collaboration so to prevent the need from all of this. So again, I'm going to focus on collaboration to prevent the need for this opportunity to exercise the due process, but it is there, and it's important that you know that it's there. So in terms of collaboration, what facilitates team collaboration, just some ideas to think about. Shared knowledge, I made reference before to that alphabet soup that doesn't serve to share the knowledge because it's special education professionals talking in another language, even though it's English. That's not accessible to other families. And, that's another point. Sometimes it is in English and that's not the native language of families. So there are provisions in the law that says that translators should be available, materials should be translated, interpreters available to make sure that knowledge can be shared. But here I was basically talking about even within the same language, our sets of initials can be exclusive. Shared knowledge about the child. I made reference to this already in terms of information at school, at home. It's really hard to have a complete picture of the child if you only know them during part of the day. There are a lot of students that behave very, very differently depending on the setting. And it's been interesting in my experience. Sometimes I'll want a parent to understand what a child is like at school, and then I'll say, well, come in and observe. And when the parent comes in, that child is not like the child typically is. And the parent is not seeing, the way the child either cooperates or doesn't cooperate or whatever. And so I've sometimes gone to videotape so that they can get an image. Same thing from the other direction, knowing what home is like, what the behaviors are like at home, the sleep patterns at home. I focus on kids with very significant disabilities, knowing the sleeping patterns, eating patterns, elimination patterns are all really important pictures of the status of a child, and only knowing about it 6 hours a day or the remaining hours a day doesn't give you the full picture. So that shared knowledge about what the child's showing interest in, what they're reading, what they're not reading, what do they seem to be liking, just helps to get a full picture. Shared language, that's what I was mentioning before about the special education alphabet soup. If you just Google special education alphabet soup, you can get a lot of these lists of terms that can be incredibly helpful. But if not that, ask for clarification. Call teachers out. Say, what are you talking about? I don't know the terms that you're using. What does this mean? Don't sit there and feel like you're supposed to know it, because you're not supposed to know it. Automatically. You need to be taught. But so don't feel bad about asking for clarification. Say, stop talking that foreign language, that special education language. Define your terms. But preparing by looking it up, but then asking on the spot too, is important. That time thing is an important one, and I want to talk a little bit about ways to compensate for time. So, there's never going to be enough team meeting time, but that doesn't mean that communication can't happen at any other times. But one best practice recommendation that comes up all the time is to talk about agreed methods of communication. How does the teacher most prefer to communicate? Is it email? Is it phone? Is it text? And the same thing from the other direction. Figuring out what the best way to be in touch is going to be incredibly helpful, and it's respectful on both parts. So the title of this was, parent collaboration. So I cast this as though I'm talking to parents, but we can certainly turn it in another direction as we think about the respect that teachers need to think about for families and asking them what their preferred methods. Then the conversation can continue outside of the team meeting. What information do they want sent home every day? The communication notebooks, in my day they were paper. In some places they're still paper, but there are considerations about what information, how much information, how are classroom teachers going to find time to write a ton of information when they're not just working with one student but with many students. And so figuring out effective, agreed upon methods of communication seems like a little, but it's a really important step in this process. Another thing to think about is don't assume that there will be a fight. So that image of Rhett that I had in the BU logo with his arms crossed, kind of assuming a fight. I know he's a bulldog, so it's appropriate, but lots of times parents will tell me they're going to assume that they're going to have to fight for their child's right, and they get into a district and find out that the fight wasn't really necessary. So I think a good place to start is don't assume that there will be one. Be prepared just in case, know the rights, but don't assume that there are going to be differences of opinion from the get-go. I alluded to this one. Recognizing teachers' commitment is important. Most teachers know that parents hold important information, but it's also important to recognize that they're in a one-to-many situation. That is, they have more than just one student, they have multiple students, and so they're responding to the students and those students' families, and their time is difficult. So recognizing that, or their time is limited, recognizing that situation is really, really important, and it ties back into what's the best way to communicate with them and how can you make sure there's a steady flow without it being overwhelming to the teacher who has responsibilities to multiple students. Another limitation that teachers may have is the system that they're a part of. So it is, I think, really important to know that teachers are not necessarily the decision makers in terms of resources. Administrators are. So teachers may have a notion about what they think is right, but they're a part of a system and they don't have the latitude to make decisions. So that suggests, well, go over their head to an administrator. That may be what's necessary, but it may be more effective to work with the teacher to figure out ways of meeting students' needs through the process of collaboration, and then bring in a larger team as necessary. Let me clarify something that I said. When it comes to the IEP team, administrators are a part of that team, but I'm talking now the in-between communication of implementing an IEP as it's been designed. Help educators recognize the family needs. So not all educators are in the position to make home visits and look at what's going on talk with families, visit their homes, see what family needs are, but educators can be helped with understanding it through the communication process. What do families see as priorities? Letting them know what your priorities are as family members for the particular child, and help them. Don't assume that they know. Help them understand. A really I think important point that I read in the literature a lot and know from my own experience is to focus on solutions, not differences of opinion. Sometimes personalities get in the way and differences of opinion get in the way. But instead of saying, all right, you think this, I think this, what's a solution? Focusing on the solution can be a tremendous facilitator to work out these differences. Sarah, I'm not seeing any questions. Are people not asking questions? Okay, fine. Okay. I thought I would, because I'm not hearing any questions. Okay, good. All right. Another important, another important, really important point is keep the focus on your child. And say it's not about us, it's about the student, it's about the child. One, one I learned this from parents. A number of parents that I've worked with, but I remember, I'm thinking of the first time I saw it. A parent had kept a notebook of all the information about her child, all the meeting notes, all the records, etc. And it was, a notebook that had one of the clear fronts, and there was a picture on the child of the child on the front. And she would periodically turn it around and say, "Remember, we're talking about him. We're not talking about systems. We're not, we're talking about him." And I thought it was incredibly effective, and I've been with other families that have done the same thing. It keeps it away from the differences and personalities, and tends to serve to keep the focus on what the main subject is, which is educational decision making around an individual child. Remember, both are on the same side, of the child. Everybody in education has gone into education, especially special education, because they like children, they're concerned about children. Everybody's on the same side. There might be differences of opinion about how to best provide services to the children, but everybody's on the child's side. So I talked earlier about one of the problems that we have in special education related to the lack of evidence-based practice. It's a growing database. We have a lot of research. We don't have things that that reach the level of qualification as evidence-based practice based on strict guidelines that are being adhered to with that that description. But you can create your quote unquote evidence-based practice based on data-based decision making. So what I mean by that is we can teach any intervention or teaching as a hypothesis to be tested. For any child, we're never really certain, we can't ever really be certain about what is the absolute best way to do something. So we come up with reasonable ideas about what to try, and then take data, try it out, take data, make sure you take the right kind of data, the right things to be collecting data on, and then your data will tell you whether it's working or not. It's not opinion, it keeps it objective. So there have been any number of times where I thought I was absolutely right about something, and we then took data and I found I was so not right. It just did not work. But it wasn't, the data told me, it wasn't somebody else telling me that it wasn't working. There was clear evidence that it was not a good intervention. So it's one way of facilitating or taking the opinion out of the picture and working together at testing hypotheses around individual children. And that just means defining an intervention, figuring out how to take data on whether that child is getting more homework done, or reading more words accurately, or reading more fluently, or answering more comprehension questions, but based on this particular intervention, but taking the data, looking at the progress, and then making decisions about whether it is working or isn't working. The opinion is taken out. We have data to make that determination. The proof is in the pudding. I wrote down, and then I thought, I have no idea what that really means. So I spent some time the other day looking that up to find out the not etiology, I never forget the word, but the source of the meaning of that word. Anyways, collaboration takes at least two, can be multiple people. As I said before, I focused on the parent part. If I was talking to teachers, I really would be saying some of the same things, but flipping it around. And I think I kind of flipped partway through. So I was talking about it from both sides. But I also have on a number of occasions asked parents what if you could talk to parents and told them some really critical things, critical do's or don'ts, what are some things that you would want me to tell them? And there are some interesting things that came up, and I will share them. Um, Parents have told me, don't ever say about parents, or to parents, I know just how you feel. Parents have told me that they couldn't possibly, because they are not in their shoes. So just something to think about. Don't ever say they're in denial. The parents are in denial. They're not accepting their child's disability. Not a good thing to say. Most parents fully understand, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a handle on who their kid is. And another don't, that they have unrealistic expectations. Who's to know what's realistic and what isn't? And we're seeing this so clearly now, in the United States with our standards-based reform, with having higher expectations for students and finding that the students are meeting those expectations in ways that they never have before. And it's because we've raised our expectations. So, I think this is a really important thing to remember. And to teachers, remember they have responsibilities as families, not just teachers of their children. This is this is from me as an early teacher, and some other reading that I've done where teachers say, well, if only the parents could keep the child on a consistent schedule, and then they would be toilet trained. And then this one great article talked about how that teacher who was critical of the parents took care of the child for the weekend and realized how impossible it was to implement that while doing grocery shopping and doing daily activities. So, remembering that in the classroom, you're working with students as teachers, but families are working as families, not just teachers of their children. And the expectations are much greater, so it's hard to implement. So, go for collaboration rather than the threat of the law or implementation of the law. And hopefully these ideas were somewhat helpful to you to think about this. So sorry to those of you who are in other countries. I apologize. I was thinking people would be on from different states. So for those of you who are here in the United States, but then again, those of you in other countries can access this too, but know that every state has a parent advocacy center that is funded by the federal government to provide support to families on how to advocate for their children. So this is the website for that, and there's a link. Oh, shoot, my link covers the org, but after the org, if you do /find your center, you can find one in each of the states, and those centers can be incredibly helpful in providing information about how to advocate for your child through your education, collaboration, and legal rights of due process. So a source of more information for you. And then back to Rhett. This is my attempt to maybe change things and change his face. And you may or may not recognize it, but his arms are not folded. They're outstretched now. And it's rough, but hopefully it makes the point that I want to make, that this works